They thought the Indian who tended the barn was nobody, just another pair of calloused hands, silent and forgettable. But what they witnessed that morning in Copper Ridge would upend everything they believed about power, dignity, and the man they'd been stepping on for months. Ayana moved through the shadows of the barn like he had every morning for the past year. His presence was quiet but unwavering, like the sunrise, predictable, unnoticed, essential. His weathered hands spread fresh hay across the wooden floor in slow, steady sweeps. Morning light trickled through the slats in the barn walls, cutting soft gold lines through the dust that danced in the still air. The scent of horses, old leather, and sun-baked wood mixed into something familiar, something grounding. To the people of Copper Ridge, he was invisible, a fixture, another tool in the barn, hired help who knew his place. And the town had made sure he never forgot it. Then the doors creaked open, and the rhythm of the morning changed. 3 men entered. First came Thaddeus Crane, the self-proclaimed master of the town, a man whose confidence came not from integrity, but from ownership. His boots, too polished for ranch life, clacked like declarations across the planks. Following him were Dutch Morrison, with his arrogant swagger, and Samuel Pike, whose smile never quite reached his eyes. The trio moved like men who believed the space belonged to them. Ayana didn't look up. He didn't stop. But his shoulders shifted just barely. He knew the cadence of those steps, knew what kind of trouble came wrapped in grins and expensive boots, knew cruelty well enough to sense its arrival before it spoke. "Well, well," Thaddeus drawled, dragging his voice through the stillness like a dull knife. "Look who's still here, boys, our faithful barn-keeper." Dutch chuckled, a sharp, nasal sound, faithful more like stuck. Ain't nobody else gonna hire an Indian. Not even another Indian. Ayana's pitchfork didn't pause. His hands moved as if untouched by their words, but inside, something stirred, not anger exactly, but a heat that had been smoldering beneath ash, a heat that knew patience. Samuel stepped forward and, with the deliberate cruelty of a bored man playing God, kicked over the bucket of grain Ayana had just prepared. The kernels scattered like spilled treasure across the barn floor. "Oops," Samuel said with mock innocence. "Clumsy me. You better clean that up. Boy." The word boy hit the air like a slap. Sharp. Humiliating. Wrong. Ayana was 45 years old. He had walked battlefields none of these men could name, carried scars earned not from accidents, but from duty. But here, in this dusty barn, he was boy to them, less than a man, a servant without history, a shadow in their empire. Thaddeus began circling, slow and predatory, as if Ayana were livestock under appraisal. "You know what I've been thinking," he said, voice slick with suggestion. "Maybe it's time we found a new caretaker, someone better suited, someone who fits in with decent folks." Ayana looked up, just once. His eyes met Thaddeus Crane's without fear, without apology, dark, steady, endless. And for a split second, the merchant faltered. In that gaze, he didn't see obedience. He didn't even see resistance. What he saw was depth, something that didn't belong in a barn, something ancient and dangerous. Dutch snorted. "Cat got your tongue," he taunted, "or maybe he don't speak proper English." Then the sound came. Hoofbeats steady, heavy, military, not a rancher's ride. This was official, purposeful, thunder on the earth that spoke of command. All 4 men turned toward the doors. The hoofbeats grew louder. Then silence. Ayana's posture shifted again, subtle but profound. He stood taller, still as a statue carved from battle-tested stone. His hand tightened around the pitchfork. His breathing changed. For the first time since the men had entered, anticipation flickered in his expression. Thaddeus frowned. Who the hell rides like that at this hour? And then the barn doors burst open. The man who stepped into the dusty light wore a blue military uniform, crisp despite the long ride. His silver insignia gleamed, and his eyes scanned the room with the discipline of a man who had seen too much, commanded too many, and trusted too few. Colonel Marcus Whitfield had arrived in Copper Ridge, but no one, not Thaddeus, not Dutch, not Samuel, could have imagined what would happen when the colonel's eyes found the quiet man holding the pitchfork, and the world they thought they understood began to shatter. Colonel Marcus Whitfield didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. The barn, moments ago filled with cheap laughter and scattered grain, fell into silence as his presence took up space like thunder held back by sheer will. He swept the room with a soldier's eye, noting the details that spoke volumes: the grain on the floor, the pitchfork clenched in a calloused hand, the uncomfortable silence of 3 smug men, suddenly unsure of their footing. Thaddeus recovered first. He stepped forward, puffing out his chest like a rooster drunk on self-importance. "Colonel," he began with a practiced smile, "welcome to Copper Ridge. Thaddeus Crane, town overseer. I trust your journey was smooth." The colonel didn't answer. He was still staring at Ayanna, but it wasn't the look of a man seeing a servant. It was recognition. Something deeper. Dutch Morrison jumped in quickly, trying to redirect attention. "Sir, if you're looking for accommodations, we've got the finest rooms west of the capital. Nothing you'd find in a barn." With he nodded toward Ayanna, his kind. The air shifted, subtle, dangerous. Colonel Whitfield's jaw tightened, his pale eyes narrowed not in confusion, but in warning. When he turned to Dutch, the man actually stumbled back a step. His instinct had finally caught up with his arrogance. "His kind," the colonel repeated, his voice like cold steel drawn slow from its scabbard. Samuel Pike tried to recover the moment, chuckling nervously. "What Dutch means, sir, is, well, we got Christian families here. Good, decent folk, not like this Indian who can't speak proper and can't keep a bucket upright." Ayanna said nothing, but something coiled within him, a silent readiness, like a bowstring pulled taut. His knuckles whitened around the pitchfork. His breath slowed. The colonel didn't acknowledge the townsmen again. Instead, he began walking slowly, deliberately across the barn floor. His boots crunched over the spilled grain with each step. The sound was like distant thunder echoing through dry hills. He stopped in front of Ayanna, face to face now. 2 men, both shaped by wars, by duty, by silence. "How long has this man worked for your town?" the colonel asked, still facing Ayanna, though his question was clearly meant for the others. Thaddeus blinked, unsure. "A year, maybe more. Hard to say. His type comes and goes. You know." Marcus's gaze remained fixed on the man before him, and then, in a motion so unexpected it seemed impossible, the colonel slowly removed his hat, an officer's hat, adorned with silver thread and the scars of campaigns, and held it at his side, with reverence. The barn went still. Even the horses ceased their restless snorts, sensing a shift in the order of things. The silence broke when Marcus finally spoke. One word, "Sir." It landed like a hammer on anvil. He wasn't mocking. He wasn't sarcastic. He wasn't mistaken. Colonel Marcus Whitfield, veteran of 20 battles, commander of thousands, had just addressed Ayanna as Sir. Thaddeus Crane went pale. Dutch Morrison's mouth opened and closed without sound. Samuel Pike stumbled back, knocking over an empty bucket that clattered loudly in the stunned silence. Ayana stood still. Then slowly, deliberately, he set the pitchfork down. The motion was graceful, final. When he straightened to his full height, the transformation was undeniable. Gone was the hunched posture of hired labor. In its place stood a man forged by duty, sharpened by purpose. "Marcus," Ayana said, his voice rich and steady. "I wondered when you'd find me." Relief flickered across the colonel's worn features. "Took longer than I hoped. Sir, trail went cold after Fort Laramie." The three men behind them froze as the world they knew fell apart at their feet. Sir Thaddeus's voice cracked like dry wood. He's just a barn hand. He cleans stalls, feeds horses." Colonel Whitfield turned toward him, and there was no kindness in his eyes now. "This man," he said, voice rising like distant cannon fire, "has cleaned up messes that would have torn this nation in two. You think he's just mucking stalls? He's prevented wars, saved lives, saved yours, though you're too blind to see it." Dutch found his voice, but it was a whimper. "But he's Indian. He don't speak proper. He ain't educated." Yana turned, his voice slicing through the insult. "I speak 7 languages." "Mr. Morrison," he said, "I've sat across from generals, presidents, and tribal councils. While you were counting pennies in your daddy's store, I was brokering peace between nations." The weight of the revelation hit like a blow. Samuel Pike collapsed onto a hay bale, his face ash-gray. The man they'd mocked, insulted, humiliated was someone whose shadow stretched far beyond the walls of this barn. Who are you?" Thaddeus whispered, barely able to speak. Ayana met his gaze not with anger, but with something heavier, something older than vengeance. "My name," he said quietly, "is Ayana Two Eagles, Chief Scout, United States Army, Congressional Medal of Honor, and until this morning, the man you never saw." Silence closed in again, thick and suffocating. Thaddeus Crane stood motionless, as if the barn floor beneath him had turned to ice. Dutch Morrison leaned against a post, pale as chalk. Samuel Pike stared at Ayana as if trying to unsee what he now knew. Colonel Whitfield took a single step forward, his tone steady, his words ringing with finality. "Gentlemen, you've just spent your morning humiliating one of the most decorated soldiers this country has ever produced. A man who has risked more for this flag than you ever will." The words slammed into them like a cannon blast. Ayana remained calm, his expression unreadable, but his presence had changed completely. The quiet laborer had become something else, something formidable. Dutch finally found breath, but he never said, he never acted like. Ayana turned to him, voice calm and sharp as a blade. "I wasn't here to impress you. Mr. Morrison, I was here to disappear." He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small case. From within it, he retrieved something that shimmered with the weight of history, a silver star, polished and radiant, engraved with an eagle and the words, "For Valor," the Congressional Medal of Honor. Gasps filled the barn like the intake of breath before a storm. Even the horses shifted, as if recognizing what hung in the light. "This," Ayana said, holding the medal where they all could see, "was awarded to me for saving an entire cavalry unit from slaughter. I walked into an Apache war camp alone. I negotiated for 3 days without food or water, and I convinced a chief who had every reason to hate me to spare 200 lives." Thaddeus looked ready to collapse. You saved soldiers," he stammered. "White soldiers," American soldiers. Ayana corrected, his voice steady. When a man is dying, I don't ask the color of his skin. I ask how I can stop the dying. The three men looked at one another, as if searching for the ground beneath them and finding none. Samuel's voice quivered. But you're one of them. You're Apache. Ayana met his gaze without blinking. I'm many things. Apache, soldier, citizen, but most of all, I'm a man. And that seems to be the one thing you can't see. Colonel Whitfield stepped in, sensing the tide rising too quickly. Sir, he said to Ayana, we still need to discuss the mission parameters. The situation grows worse by the hour. But Ayana wasn't finished. He turned his eyes back to the townsman. This time, what he showed wasn't fury, but disappointment, the kind that cut deeper than any insult. You want to know what savage really means? He asked, voice low, steady. It's not the man defending his land. It's not the mother mourning her son. It's not the elder who refuses to bow. It's this. He swept a hand toward the grain on the floor, the spilled bucket, the smug faces now drained of color. It's treating a man like an animal because you're afraid to see the human underneath. Thaddeus tried to speak, but shame had stolen his tongue. What apology could possibly reach across the years of indifference, of sneers and slights? Ayana walked slowly across the barn, each step measured, like a judge circling a courtroom. He passed the very men who once sneered at him, and not one of them dared meet his eyes. You think you're civilized, he said, voice echoing in the rafters. But civilization isn't in the fine boots or bank accounts. It's in how you treat the man with nothing. Colonel Whitfield checked his watch, the faint click of its opening snapping the moment back to urgency. Sir, we need to leave. If the Apache don't hear from us soon, Standing Bear might lose patience. And if he does, Ayana nodded. I know. But before we ride, there's something these men need to understand. The barn seemed smaller now, the walls closer, the weight of truth pressing inward from all sides. Thaddeus Crane's fingers trembled by his sides. He was a man used to controlling conversations with a look, a name, a ledger. But here, in this sun-drenched barn full of spilled grain and broken illusions, he was powerless. Colonel Whitfield stepped forward, his voice clipped, professional. Mr. Two Eagles, I bring orders from General Sherman himself. Your country needs you again. Ayana didn't answer right away. He stood very still, like a man feeling the weight of old armor settling on shoulders that had nearly forgotten its burden. What's happened? He finally asked, quiet but firm. Whitfield's jaw tightened. Apache raids, southern settlements, 3 towns hit, families gone, children taken. The governor's demanding military response. But we both know what that means. Blood, scorched homes, retaliation without reason. Ayana nodded once. The air seemed heavier now. His silence spoke of long memories and deeper regrets. They need someone they trust, someone who can speak their language and calm the storm. Dutch Morrison, still recovering from the earlier blow to his pride, stiffened. You mean, you're going to negotiate with them, with savages? The temperature dropped again. Ayana turned, slowly, deliberately, until he faced Dutch. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Savages. Mr. Morrison, he asked, each syllable as sharp as flint. Dutch backed up a half-step instinctively, as if Ayana's words had weight. In your vast experience with native peoples, Ayana continued, how many Apache children have you seen starve because their hunting grounds were stripped bare? How many mothers have you watched bury their sons, Slain for defending land that was once promised, Samuel's voice came in weakly, like a leaf caught in a windstorm. They attack innocent settlers. They kill people. Ayanna looked at him long and hard. So do I. The words hit like thunder. I've killed more men than you've shaken hands with. The difference is, I do it when there's no language left to speak, but death. Colonel Whitfield stepped forward, recognizing the dark tide rising again. Sir, time is of the essence. Chief Standing Bear won't wait much longer. Ayanna didn't move yet. His eyes were still locked on the three men. Then, without warning, he reached into his shirt and pulled out something small, worn, and sacred. A leather pouch. He opened it slowly and retrieved 3 silver coins, simple, gleaming, unspent. He placed them one by one on the wooden railing near the scattered hay. My wages, he said, voice low. For the year I worked in your barn. Samuel Pike looked stricken. We never paid you. Never even offered I know, Ayanna replied, his voice calm, almost sorrowful. But I earned them honestly, and honest work deserves honest pay, even when employers forget their obligations. The coins gleamed in the light like tiny mirrors, reflecting not Ayanna's dignity, but the failures of those who stood before him. Thaddeus stepped forward, voice cracked with guilt. Keep the money. It's yours. It's the least we can do. I don't want your money. Mr. Crane, Ayanna said, I want you to remember this moment. Remember that character isn't built in banks or built on property lines. It's revealed when no one's watching. He turned toward the barn door, ready to go. But then he stopped. There's something else, he said, not turning around. His voice now held something unexpected. Not anger, not bitterness, but a quiet, devastating mercy. Thaddeus looked up with desperate eyes. What is it? Ayanna finally turned to face them again. The night you refused me a table at your restaurant, he said to Thaddeus. I was returning from tracking the men who murdered a family outside Prescott. A white family. Mother, father, 2 children. I hunted their killers for 6 days across mountains and desert, and I brought every one of them back alive for justice. The silence was total. Thaddeus staggered, as if struck. You protected us, even after. I wasn't protecting you, Ayanna said firmly. I was protecting the idea that no child should grow up afraid, that no mother should sleep with a rifle beside her cradle. Dutch's voice cracked with raw guilt. God help us. What have we done? Ayanna's reply was simple. You've learned. Maybe that's enough. Sometimes it has to be. Colonel Whitfield glanced toward the rising sun. Time was slipping. Each minute lost could cost lives. But Ayanna stood rooted, gaze locked on the 3 men as if measuring the weight of their souls. There's something else you need to understand, Ayanna said, his voice taking on a harder edge. Not about me, about what you've put at risk. Samuel swallowed. Risk? What risk? Ayanna turned to face him squarely. 3 months ago, he began, you refused to sell grain to a group of Apache men who came to town. Do you remember? Samuel blinked rapidly, his face draining of color. I thought they were just drifters. I didn't know they were scouts, Ayanna said, cutting through his excuses like a scalpel. They came peacefully. They came with money. They were there to keep the peace. And you turned them away, called them red devils, told them to starve. The words echoed like judgment in a courtroom. Dutch stammered. We couldn't have known. We don't read minds. No, Ayanna said evenly. But you could have listened. You could have looked them in the eye and seen men instead of monsters. You chose not to. Then Colonel Whitfield's voice dropped in with finality. One of those scouts was Chief Standing Bear's nephew. The weight of that sentence hit like a dropped anvil. They took your refusal, he continued, as confirmation that diplomacy was pointless, that war was the only language you people understood. Thaddeus's hands trembled at his sides. You mean, because we refused to sell them grain? They began preparing for war, Ayanna said. You didn't just insult them. You closed the last door they were still willing to knock on. He stepped forward, and suddenly the barn couldn't hold his presence. You think your words don't matter? That prejudice is just noise. No, it echoes, it ripples, and sometimes it sets fires. The silence was shattered only by the sound of Whitfield checking his watch again. The tick of its mechanism seemed louder than ever before. Sir, he said urgently, the Apache forces are moving. If we don't ride soon, Ayanna raised a hand, stopping him. He turned back to the three men, no longer barn tormentors, but figures hollowed by guilt and the growing understanding of how close they'd come to destroying everything they held dear. You see that town out there? He asked, nodding toward the barn doors. Every building, every family, every night you sleep without gunfire in your streets. It exists because men like me bled in places you'll never see. Colonel Whitfield joined him at the doors. Sir, perhaps we should focus on the mission. Ayanna's answer was quiet, resolute. The mission starts here. He turned to Thaddeus, his posture now unmistakably that of a commander. You call yourself the voice of this town, he said. Then you're going to make a choice. Right now. Thaddeus looked up, his voice dry as sand. What choice? Ayanna's answer came like a warning bell before the storm. The raids I'm being sent to stop, they're heading this way. 3 war parties, 40 warriors, angry, armed, desperate. Gasps escaped the men's lips. I can stop them, Ayanna continued. I can speak to Standing Bear. I can pull this town back from the edge. But you have to decide what you stand for. Samuel's voice cracked. What do you want from us? Nothing more than what should have been given freely. Ayanna replied. Respect, dignity, a willingness to see beyond skin and accent. Dutch whispered. If we promise to change. Ayanna didn't flinch. Promises are wind. Mr. Morrison, I want actions. I want this town to remember that the man you step over today might be the only one who can save you tomorrow. Colonel Whitfield's voice grew insistent. Sir, the horses are ready. If we're to stop bloodshed, we must go now. Ayanna walked toward the barn doors and paused at the threshold, bathed in golden morning light. The silhouette of a warrior, not just of battles, but of conscience. Thaddeus stepped forward. Wait, please. What can we do? How do we make this right? Ayanna turned one last time, not as a laborer, not even as a soldier, as a man who had carried both the burden of prejudice and the power to end it. You start, he said, by treating the next stranger who walks into your town like a human being, not a threat. You see them, you listen, you act with decency, not fear. He reached for his hat and placed it on his head with quiet precision. As for making things right with me, he said, voice low but clear, you can't, but you can make sure it never happens again. And then he stepped out into the light, leaving behind not just the barn, but the echo of a choice, one that would define not just the men he left behind, but the soul of Copper Ridge itself. Ayanna. 2 eagles walked away from the barn without looking back. Colonel Whitfield mounted his horse beside him. The 2 men, one uniformed, one cloaked in dignity, rode side by side toward Apache territory, toward the edge of diplomacy, toward the fragile hope of peace. Behind them, the barn stood frozen in stillness. 3 men remained inside, unmoving, unblinking, each trying to understand how everything they thought they knew had just crumbled. The silver coins sat untouched on the rail, shimmering like accusations. The spilled grain still littered the floor, but it no longer looked like the mess of a careless worker. It looked like evidence of cruelty, of blindness, of shame. Thaddeus Crane picked up one of the coins. It was warm from Ayana's pocket, real, solid, honest, everything he hadn't been. "What do we do now?" Samuel Pike whispered. For once, Thaddeus had no answer, not a scheme, not a strategy, not a word. 2 weeks later, news reached Copper Ridge, Ayana. 2 eagles had negotiated peace. Chief Standing Bear stood down. No more settlements were burned, no more families displaced, no children made orphans. The territorial governor called it a miracle of diplomacy, but Thaddeus, Dutch, and Samuel knew better. It wasn't a miracle. It was a man they'd tried to break, a man they hadn't seen until it was too late. The change in Copper Ridge didn't come overnight, but it came. Thaddeus stopped denying loans based on skin color. Dutch took down the sign that warned certain folks away from his saloon. Samuel began learning Apache words, slowly, awkwardly, but earnestly. The 3 coins were never spent. They sat above the mantel in Thaddeus Crane's house, polished clean but never touched. Not because they were sacred, but because they were a reminder, a reckoning. They never saw Ayana again. He completed 3 more peace missions and then disappeared into the vast lands where a man could live without titles. Some said he returned to his people. Others believed he helped the government draft Indian policy. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was what he left behind. Years later, when strangers arrived in Copper Ridge, men with different skin, different languages, different gods, they found something surprising, a town that no longer judged by appearance, a town that looked a man in the eye before deciding who he was, a town that had learned that power isn't about who you step over, but who you choose to lift. And above the mantle, still gleaming under the dustless light, 3 silver coins waited silently, proof that even a heart built on pride could learn the shape of humility. And sometimes, the man you ignored, the one cleaning your stalls, could be the one who saves everything you hold dear. Years passed. The town of Copper Ridge changed not in banners or speeches, but in choices, quiet, consistent choices. No one spoke much about the man in the barn anymore, but his absence hung heavier than his presence ever did. He had become a myth, but not the kind born of exaggeration, the kind born of truth so deep it humbles you to repeat it. The kind that lives in glances exchanged when someone is tempted to speak in judgment. The kind that makes a man pause before saying they instead of we. The general store began serving everyone with honest money. The saloon opened its doors without question. The banker stopped asking what nation you were born into, and started asking how hard you worked. Strangers noticed. Some said Copper Ridge was different, fairer, quieter. Others said it felt like a place that had seen something holy and hadn't quite recovered. No one ever moved the coins from Thaddeus Crane's mantle. They remained untouched. Not because they were valuable, but because they couldn't be replaced. They weren't wages anymore. They were a mirror, and every man in that town had stood before it at least once and asked himself, who was I that day in the barn? Who am I now, children, grew up hearing whispers of the man with the pitchfork, not the war hero, not the medal wearer, just the man who cleaned stalls and asked nothing until he was forced to. They learned that justice doesn't always roar into town on horseback. Sometimes it walks in quietly, wearing worn boots, spreading hay in the dark, and somewhere out beyond the mountains, beyond the line where maps lose their confidence, a man named Ayana Two Eagles lived in peace. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he was still working, still negotiating with ghosts, still walking into hostile places to calm fires before they ignited. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was the path he left behind, clear, firm, and just wide enough for a town to follow. Ayana Two Eagles was never seen in Copper Ridge again, but he never truly left. He remained in the way people held doors a moment longer, in the way they looked one another in the eye before judging, in the way children were taught that strength isn't in how loudly a man speaks, but in how deeply he listens. The barn still stands. The grain has long been swept, but the story of that morning lingers like smoke after a fire. Some say it changed the town forever. Others say it revealed what had always been broken. And maybe that's the point. Sometimes, justice doesn't come with a gun. Sometimes, it comes wearing work boots, and when it does, you better know who you're looking at before it's too late. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who's ever been overlooked, stepped on, or underestimated because they might be the one who saves everything you care about. And if you think this story was powerful, wait until you hear what happened when a wounded Apache chief carried a white girl through enemy territory, risking his own tribe's wrath to save her life. Click the video on the screen now. I promise, it's one you'll never forget.